She looked like every small-town librarian you'd ever seen. The detectives at Pine Ridge Police Department exchanged glances as the middle-aged woman in the cardigan sweater and reading glasses approached their conference table. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she clutched a worn leather satchel that probably contained nothing more threatening than overdue book notices. "This is who's going to help us solve a case we've been stuck on for 3 years," Detective Rodriguez muttered under his breath. "She looks like she's never been outside the fiction section." Margaret Chun said nothing, just quietly took her seat and opened her notebook with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades organizing information. But when she started connecting dots that had eluded experienced investigators for months, when she began revealing patterns hidden in plain sight, the room fell silent. And you would have realized, just like they did, that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in law enforcement isn't a gun or a badge, it's a mind trained to see what others miss. Tuesday morning at the Pine Ridge Police Department, a mid-sized facility serving a Colorado mountain town of 12,000 residents. The conference room was cramped and outdated, with a whiteboard covered in crime scene photos, timelines, and evidence markers that told the story of the department's most frustrating unsolved case. Detective Captain Sarah Mitchell had called in a civilian consultant, much to the skepticism of her investigative team. Margaret Churn was 58 years old and had been the head librarian at Pine Ridge Public Library for the past 8 years. She lived quietly in a small house 3 blocks from downtown, drove a sensible Honda Civic, and was known throughout the community as the woman who could find any book, answer any research question, and organize any information system with remarkable efficiency. What the residents of Pine Ridge didn't know was that before Margaret had come to their mountain town, she had spent 17 years as an intelligence analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency, specializing in pattern recognition, data mining, and counterintelligence operations. She had tracked terrorist financing networks through labyrinthine banking records, identified foreign operatives through seemingly random social media patterns, and connected dots across multiple time zones and languages to prevent attacks that the American public would never know had been planned. The case that had brought Margaret to the police station was the Pine Ridge burglar, a serial criminal who had been targeting homes throughout the area for 3 years. The perpetrator was extraordinarily careful, never leaving fingerprints, never taking obvious items like jewelry or electronics, and never following predictable patterns in terms of timing or target selection. 12 homes had been burglarized, with losses totaling over $300,000, and the police had no viable suspects. Detective Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran who prided himself on his investigative skills, had initially resisted Captain Mitchell's suggestion to bring in a civilian consultant, especially one whose only apparent qualification was organizing books and helping high school students with research papers. "Look, Captain," Rodriguez had said when Mitchell first proposed the idea, "I appreciate that librarians are good at finding information, but police work requires understanding criminal behavior, forensic analysis, and investigative procedure. This isn't about looking up facts in a database." Mitchell had heard similar objections from Detective Barnes, a younger investigator who had recently completed advanced training in criminal psychology. "Captain, with all due respect, we've already consulted with the state police, the FBI behavioral unit, and private security experts. What can a small-town librarian possibly tell us that trained investigators haven't already figured out?" But Mitchell had her reasons for bringing Margaret in. Over the past 8 years, she'd watched the librarian work on various community projects, organizing information, identifying patterns, and solving logistical problems with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Margaret had revolutionized the library's catalog system, created research databases that were more comprehensive than anything the police department used, and had an uncanny ability to find connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. More importantly, Mitchell had noticed something about Margaret's background that didn't quite add up. For someone who claimed to have worked in information services before coming to Pine Ridge, Margaret knew an awful lot about security systems, surveillance techniques, and investigative methodology. She asked unusually sophisticated questions about crime prevention and showed familiarity with law enforcement terminology that seemed inconsistent with a career in library science. Margaret entered the conference room carrying her leather satchel and a legal pad covered with neat handwriting. She wore a grey cardigan over a white blouse, comfortable walking shoes, and the kind of wire-rimmed glasses that suggested someone who spent most of her time reading. Everything about her appearance reinforced the stereotype of a mild-mannered librarian who lived a quiet, academic life. The investigative team consisted of Rodriguez, Barnes, Detective Lisa Wank, and Detective Tom Anderson. They had spent countless hours analyzing the burglary cases, interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, and followed up on dozens of leads that had gone nowhere. The evidence was spread across the conference table. Crime scene photos, victim statements, forensic reports, and timeline charts that showed the seemingly random pattern of the break-ins. Margaret took her seat and spent several minutes studying the materials without saying anything. The detectives watched her with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. She read through victim statements, examined crime scene photos, and made notes in a small, precise handwriting that looked more like code than regular text. After 20 minutes of silence, Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we appreciate you taking the time to look at this, but we've been through all of this evidence dozens of times. Is there anything specific you're looking for?" Margaret looked up from her notes. "I am looking for patterns that might not be immediately obvious to investigators who are focused on traditional criminal behavior models." Barnes leaned forward. "What kind of patterns?" Margaret opened her satchel and pulled out a laptop computer that looked more sophisticated than anything the police department owned. As she powered it up, the detectives noticed that her movements around technology were fluid and professional, inconsistent with the stereotypical image of an elderly librarian struggling with modern equipment. "First," she said, "I'd like to input all of your data into an analytical framework that can identify correlations across multiple variables simultaneously. Traditional investigation focuses on obvious connections, geographical proximity, temporal patterns, victim demographics. But complex criminal behavior often operates according to subtler organizing principles." Wand looked confused. "What kind of organizing principles?" Margaret began typing rapidly, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the speed and precision of someone who had spent years managing complex databases. "The burglary cases aren't random," she said. "They appear random because the organizing logic isn't immediately visible to conventional analysis." She connected her laptop to the room's projection system and brought up a map of Pine Ridge with the 12 burglary locations marked in red. The dots appeared scattered across the town with no obvious geographical pattern. "This is what you've been looking at," Margaret said. 12 apparently random targets with no clear connecting logic. "But watch what happens when I overlay additional data." She began adding layers to the map. Property tax records, utility usage patterns, vehicle registration data, employment records, and social media activity. With each new layer, the seemingly random pattern began to reveal an underlying structure. The burglar isn't selecting targets based on wealth, opportunity, or convenience, Margaret explained. He's selecting them based on lifestyle predictability. Every one of these homes belongs to people whose daily routines can be precisely tracked through digital footprints. Anderson frowned. Digital footprints. Margaret highlighted specific data points on each targeted home. Social media posts showing family vacations, work schedules posted on company websites, children's sports team schedules, gym memberships with check-in patterns, grocery delivery services with regular time slots. The burglar is using open-source intelligence to identify homes that will be empty at predictable times. Rodriguez studied the screen more carefully. "That's a pretty sophisticated approach for a simple burglar." "It is," Margaret agreed. "Which suggests this isn't a simple burglar. This is someone with training in surveillance and intelligence gathering." The room fell quiet as the implications sank in. The detectives had been looking for a typical criminal who broke into homes for money or drugs. Margaret was suggesting they were dealing with someone who operated more like a professional intelligence operative. Barnes asked the question everyone was thinking. "How do you know about open-source intelligence gathering?" Margaret paused for a moment, and the detectives noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. The mild-mannered librarian facade didn't disappear, but something sharper and more alert flickered behind her eyes. "I spent several years working in information analysis before I came to Pine Ridge," she said carefully. "Pattern recognition and data correlation were part of my previous job." "What kind of information analysis?" Wonk pressed. Margaret's fingers moved across her laptop keyboard, bringing up additional data overlays. "Government work. Security clearance required. I specialized in identifying patterns in complex data sets to predict and prevent various types of activities." The euphemistic language wasn't lost on any of the detectives. Government work with security clearance that involved preventing activities was intelligence community speak for classified operations. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. Ma'am, are you telling us you worked for the CIA? Margaret continued working on her laptop for several seconds before answering. I worked for an agency that specializes in analyzing threats to national security. The specific details of my employment are still classified, but my skills in pattern recognition and data analysis are directly applicable to criminal investigation. The room fell silent as the detectives processed what they'd just learned. Their small-town librarian was apparently a former intelligence analyst with training in counterintelligence operations. Mitchell spoke for the first time since the briefing began. Margaret, can you use those skills to help us identify our burglar? Margaret turned back to her laptop and began pulling up additional databases that none of the detectives recognized. With your permission, I'd like to access some federal databases that might provide additional insight into our suspect's identity and methods. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret demonstrated analytical capabilities that went far beyond anything the Pine Ridge Police Department had ever encountered. She cross-referenced the burglary patterns with federal databases tracking individuals with intelligence training, identified subtle surveillance techniques that indicated professional-level preparation, and built a behavioral profile that painted a picture of someone with military or intelligence background who was using professional skills for criminal purposes. She showed them how the burglar had conducted advanced reconnaissance on each target, using techniques that were taught in intelligence training programs, how he had avoided security systems by understanding their technological limitations, how he had selected items to steal based on their resale value in specific markets that suggested knowledge of international smuggling networks. Most importantly, she identified a pattern in the timing of the burglaries that corresponded to federal employee payroll schedules, suggesting that their suspect might be a former government employee who was timing his criminal activities around his own financial needs. By the end of the morning, Margaret had transformed the Pine Ridge burglar from an unsolvable mystery into a defined target with specific characteristics, probable background, and predictable future behavior patterns. Rodriguez stared at the comprehensive suspect profile that Margaret had developed. Ma'am, this is incredible work. But I have to ask, why are you working as a librarian if you can do this kind of analysis? Margaret began packing up her laptop and notes. After 17 years of tracking threats to national security, I wanted to do something that helped my local community in a more direct and visible way. Library work allows me to use my research and organizational skills to help people access information and education. It's quieter than intelligence work, but it's still valuable. Barnes leaned forward. But you're clearly overqualified for organizing books and helping kids with homework. Margaret smiled slightly. Every skill set can be applied to multiple purposes. The same analytical techniques I use to track terrorist financing networks help me organize library collections and assist patrons with complex research projects. The same pattern recognition abilities I use to identify foreign operatives help me identify which books a particular reader might enjoy. One asked the obvious follow-up question. Would you be willing to consult on other cases? We've got several unsolved investigations that might benefit from your analytical approach. Margaret considered the question carefully. I came to Pine Ridge to live a quiet life, she said. But if I can help solve cases that keep this community safe, I'm willing to assist on an occasional basis. Over the following weeks, Margaret's analysis led to the arrest of David Porter, a former NSA technician who had been discharged for psychological instability and had turned his intelligence training toward criminal enterprises. Porter had been conducting surveillance on Pine Ridge residents for months, using techniques he'd learned in government service to identify optimal targets for burglary. The arrest solved not just the Pine Ridge burglaries, but led to the discovery of similar operations in 3 other Colorado towns. Porter had been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used intelligence community tradecraft to conduct seemingly random crimes across multiple jurisdictions. Margaret's involvement in the case became the stuff of local legend. Word spread throughout Pine Ridge that their quiet librarian was actually a former CIA analyst who had helped solve the town's most challenging criminal case. But rather than seeking publicity or recognition, Margaret returned to her quiet life at the library, helping patrons find books and organizing community reading programs. The police department, however, began consulting her regularly on complex cases, missing person investigations that required analyzing large amounts of digital evidence, financial crimes that involved tracing money through complex networks, cybercrimes that required understanding sophisticated technological surveillance. Margaret's dual identity as librarian and intelligence analyst became an open secret in Pine Ridge. Parents began bringing their teenagers to meet her, hoping that exposure to someone with her background might inspire them to pursue careers in government service or intelligence analysis. High school students working on research projects discovered that their librarian could guide them through analytical techniques that were far more sophisticated than anything taught in their classes. College students home on break found that Margaret could provide insights into career paths in intelligence and national security that no guidance counselor could match. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret demonstrated that the skills learned in highly classified government service could be transformed into tools for community service and local problem solving. She showed that analytical thinking, pattern recognition, and systematic investigation weren't just useful for national security, they were valuable for any situation that required understanding complex information and making connections between seemingly unrelated facts. Margaret Chen never sought credit for her role in solving the Pine Ridge burglaries, but her reputation as someone who could see patterns that others missed spread throughout the region. Police departments in neighboring towns began requesting her consultation on their most challenging cases. She worked with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation on cold cases that had stalled due to the overwhelming amount of evidence that needed to be analyzed. She helped the FBI field office in Denver identify patterns in cybercrime that had eluded their traditional investigative approaches. But she always returned to her primary role as Pine Ridge's librarian, helping community members access information, learn new skills, and understand the complex world around them. Her government service had taught her that information was power, and her library work allowed her to democratize that power by making it available to anyone who walked through the library doors. The teenagers who had initially snickered about their town's boring librarian began to understand that they were in the presence of someone who had spent years protecting American national security interests. They learned that heroism didn't always involve dramatic action. Sometimes it involved sitting quietly in front of a computer, analyzing data, and identifying threats before they could materialize. College students studying criminal justice, international relations, and computer science discovered that Margaret could provide insights into their coursework that no textbook could match. She had lived through the experiences they were studying, had applied theoretical concepts in real-world situations that carried life and death consequences. Parents in Pine Ridge began to understand that their children's librarian was also their community's secret weapon against complex problems that required sophisticated analytical thinking. When the town faced challenges with budget planning, infrastructure development, or emergency preparedness, they turned to Margaret for the kind of systematic analysis that had once been used to protect national security. Margaret's story spread beyond Pine Ridge, inspiring other communities to recognize that valuable expertise often comes disguised as ordinary civilian service. Retired intelligence officers, former military analysts, and other professionals with specialized government training were living quietly in small towns across America, using their skills in ways that didn't attract attention but still made significant contributions to their communities. Libraries began to be recognized not just as repositories of books, but as centers of analytical capability staffed by people whose backgrounds and skills extended far beyond traditional library science. The stereotype of librarians as quiet, mild-mannered book organizers gave way to an understanding that information professionals often possessed sophisticated capabilities in research, analysis, and problem-solving. Margaret Chen proved that retirement from government service didn't mean retirement from service entirely. It meant finding new ways to apply highly developed skills to different challenges, new methods for protecting and strengthening communities, and new opportunities to share knowledge and expertise with people who could benefit from them. The quiet librarian who had helped solve Pine Ridge's most challenging criminal case continued to help her community access information, develop critical thinking skills, and understand the complex world around them. But now they understood that when she helped them research a topic, organize information, or analyze a complex problem, they were receiving guidance from someone who had spent years doing the same work at the highest levels of American intelligence. Sometimes the most valuable resources in a community are the ones that don't advertise their capabilities. Sometimes the most effective problem solvers are the ones who prefer to work quietly behind the scenes. Sometimes the most important protectors are the ones who look like ordinary citizens, but carry within themselves skills and knowledge that can make the difference between safety and danger, between solved and unsolved, between understanding and confusion. Margaret Chun learned that her years of intelligence service hadn't ended when she left government employment. They had just entered a new phase, focused on a different kind of national security. The security that comes from having strong, informed, analytically capable communities populated by citizens who understand that information is power and that power should be shared with everyone who needs it. If this story changed how you think about the people who serve your community in quiet ways, if it made you realize that expertise often hides behind ordinary job titles and unassuming appearances, then share it with someone who needs to understand that heroes work in libraries, schools, hospitals, and community centers. Honor the Margaret Chuns in your community, the quiet professionals who have served at the highest levels, but now choose to serve at the local level. Recognize that the person helping you find a book, organize information, or solve a complex problem might have capabilities and experience that extend far beyond what their current job title suggests. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes and unrecognized expertise, and hit that like button if you believe that knowledge and analytical thinking are essential tools for building stronger communities. In the comments below, tell us about a time when someone surprised you by revealing skills or experience you never suspected. Let's celebrate the moments when assumptions crumble and we discover that extraordinary capability often wears ordinary disguises.